said, I came here first of all in 1994. I came with some foreknowledge of that devastation that had been wrought on this country. And in the period since then, I've learned a lot more. And I've spent a lot of time trying to understand the answer to that question and generate an answer to that question. So what I've discovered is that answers to questions like that are very complex. They are dependent upon a series of trends, of events, and of decisions made by people in the past, which all come together at one time to create a particular set of events, such as the bombing of Laos. So to start with, three very quick points. One is technical or technological. It happened because they could. I want to underscore because they could, because I'm going to return to it at the end of what I have to say. America had developed the most astonishing capacity in both aircraft manufacture and in the creation of instruments of aerial bombardment. And those two came together, first of all, believe it or not, in 1911, when, not under America, an Italian plane dropped a bomb on, well, a hand grenade really, on an oasis in Libya. Despite this imaginative drawing by some enthusiastic artist, it is said to have caused no damage at all. Now just think, 34 years later, a mere 34 years later, and a bomb, a single bomb, was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, destroying the entire city and all life within it pretty well. 100,000 people killed by one bomb. Just 34 years separated those two events. And during that time, of course, there were many events during which the bombing of civilians became almost commonplace. And that leads really to the second point, that we've developed a culture. We did develop a culture then, and we've continued it since, that bombing civilians is somehow okay, despite the fact that we have entered into numerous treaties and conventions to try and prevent the bombing of civilians. And very prominent people have led this bombing of civilians and done so with impunity. You might recognize these gentlemen. The one on the left is Winston Churchill, later Prime Minister of Great Britain. In his earlier incarnation as the Minister for the Colonies, he had charge of policing the British mandate in Iraq. And he found it cheaper and easier to use bombs to annihilate villages that were being unruly. And he carried that with him into World War II, where he very much sponsored the bombing of German cities, a large number of them. Franklin Delano Roosevelt started World War II by calling upon all armed parties to abandon any thought of bombing civilians. By the end of World War II, he had joined in the chorus of those enthusiastically supporting the bombing of Japanese cities with a massive loss of civilian life. So that's the culture. And the third thing is colonization. Laos was a colony. And at the end of World War II, there were many colonies throughout the world that were striving to achieve independence. And none more so than here in Southeast Asia, where France had sway at the time. And the first person to progress with that ambition here was Ho Chi Minh, who had long promoted the vision of Vietnamese independence. In Laos, he was joined by three princes who one of whom was Prince Suphanavong. I won't rehearse the names of the others. Suphanavong enters the story a bit more. They wanted to achieve independence for Laos. And Suphanavong went off to meet Ho Chi Minh in Hanoi and told him that, that Laos was seeking the support of America in its independence bid. Ho Chi Minh said to him, "My boy," well, he might not have said that, but words to that effect. He was addressing a prince after all. He said, "Forget it, forget it. I've tried 7 times to write to the President of America to get his support for our independence bid, and I've never got a reply, and I bet you'll never get a reply from him either." And he was right. And so he said, "Look here, if you want independence and you need support from some major international power, then there is one country that will support you, and that is Russia. But you have to become communist." Well, Suphanavong said effectively, "Yeah, why not? It's Tuesday morning." So he said, "Right," and he went back to Laos effectively, and he set up an organization called the Pathet Lao. Now, you can forgive Ho Chi Minh if he was just ever so slightly doubtful about the intent of this gentleman, this noble Lao prince, this aristocrat. Was he really a communist? And he wanted somebody who was going to be there for the long haul. He had a bunch of young radical Lao and Lao Vietnamese in Hanoi at the time, and he determined to put those into the Pathet Lao to stiffen Suphanavong's resolve. The leader of those young lads was a man called Gaison Pombihan. So they were put into the Pathet Lao to do the job. Now move on a bit, 1954. And the French are determined to deliver a final coup de grace, that's French, to the Viet Minh. And they planned to do this at Dien Bien Phu. But unfortunately for the French, it didn't work out that way, because on May 7th, 1954, the Viet Minh overran this amazing complex of fortresses at Dien Bien Phu. The following day in Geneva, the nations gathered together and heard from the French that there was now no longer to be French colonies in Southeast Asia. Now that was the time when Suphanavong could have said, "Yes, we've done it, we've got our independence. Okay, fellas, you can all go home." But he didn't. And he didn't because of those young radicals who were there in the Pathet Lao and kept him on the Ho Chi Minh track to differentiate from the better known route, which is this one, but I'm coming to this one. The Geneva Accord which was achieved in 1954 said we're going to divide the country into 2, that's Vietnam, into 2. North, communist, south, non-communist. It's along the 17th parallel. And what we're going to do is we're going to have an election in July 1956, and that will decide who's going to govern the whole lot. So that should have been the end of the story as well, but it wasn't, because there was no election. There was no election. So Ho Chi Minh said, well, we haven't been able to achieve our objectives politically or diplomatically. We must achieve them militarily. And in order to do that, we need to be able to communicate directly between the north of Vietnam and the south of Vietnam. We need to be able to send men and material down there to our colleagues in the south. And so we need a route. And that was the beginning, in 1958, of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, so called, which allowed communication between the two. Okay, come 1961, Dwight Eisenhower met up with his successor, John F. Kennedy, in the White House to do a handover job. And he told Kennedy, the biggest problem that you have got internationally is Laos. Laos, he said. Surprise. And he said, you may well have to go in there and put boots on the ground and kick those commies out because the places. And in June 1964, 2 of them were shot down by anti-aircraft guns. America said, we've got to do something about that. We're going to take out those anti-aircraft guns and we're going to take them out with bombs. They went and bombed the Ack gun emplacements, and that was the beginning of 9 years continuous bombing, which led to the most incredible tonnage of bombs being dropped over Laos. That is the simplistic version of how Laos came to be bombed. It's much more complex than that. However, I was born in 1941. That's not funny. That's me in the middle. 1940, that was in 1942, a year later, you see. I didn't come out quite like that. And this was a great time for bombing, of course. This was World War II time. And there was a lot of bombing going on in the world. And so I grew up in this culture of bombing. Indeed, I was surrounded by people, friends, family, and so on, who were in the forces and going and waging war and defeating evil in Europe. And one of those people was a hero, another Mike Boddington, who was my father. Now imagine this guy was an ace, an RAF Spitfire ace, and he was my dad. I mean, how amazing can that be? So you get a feeling of being acculturated immediately into a military type. Britain had the biggest empire that had ever been assembled in the world. It was colored pink on the atlases. And the sun never set on the British Empire. I mean, how proud did that make a young man growing up in the 50s? It was incredible. It was just amazing. And then in 1962, we can move on, yeah, a demonstration by the University Ban the Bomb Association. And they were all there with their placards, and I was hanging around watching with nothing better to do, and all of a sudden a microphone was thrust under my nose, and a voice said, "And what do you think about all of this?" And I said, "Oh, it's pointless." And the voice said, "Why is it pointless?" And I said, "Well, because they want unilateral nuclear disarmament, and that's pointless." "Why is that pointless?" he said, and so on and so on. The following morning, I was walking around the university, and I bumped into the president of the University Ban the Bomb Society, and he said to me, "You should be ashamed of yourself." Now, I have remembered that all down the years. That was in 1962, and here we are in 2016, and it still weighs with me. I am ashamed of myself. I'm very ashamed of myself. There are 3 things upon which we can take, I mean, there are many things, but these 3 things for the purpose of today, upon which we can take a yes or no position. We can say yes to bombing, or no. Or we can say yes to going to war, to fight evil. Or we can say no, no wars. Or we can say yes to killing, or we should never kill anybody at all under any circumstance. And I've come to the position where I take a strong no on all of those. Part of them is because of my experience here in Laos, what I've learned of what happened and why it happened. No to bombing, no to wars, and no to killing. Now, to do this, one has to go through a process. And the process is this. First, I must inform myself about what is being done in my name. Always remember that when the nations go out to war, it's in your name that they go out to war. So you must inform yourself about the true circumstances of what is being done. Number two is that you must take a position. You must take a position because this is being done in your name on whether it's right or whether it's wrong. And then thirdly, you must pursue what you think is right. And that, of course, I must pursue what I think is right. Now, in my life, I've never got out there and demonstrated against wars. And I'm ashamed of that too. I've never gone out and demonstrated. I took no role in the Vietnam War or the war against Laos. I wasn't informed in part, big part. Okay? And I'm somewhat ashamed of all of that, that I allowed that to happen. Now, Noam Chomsky, one of the greatest thinkers in the world today, he said, I have responsibility for the violence committed by my state. To criticize other states for their atrocities is about as useless as criticizing those who committed atrocities in the 18th century, since I can do nothing about it. Very important message here, and the message is this. Chomsky is saying, don't let's start criticizing Iraq or Libya or Syria. He's saying, I will criticize my state for what it does. We can reduce that further. We can say, if I can criticize my state, it's much more effective if I criticize my community, because I have much more effect there. It's more effective if I criticize in my workplace, if I criticize in my family. And finally, there's nowhere left to go but me. I have complete responsibility for me and what I do. So, that brings me to a little cartoon about a gentleman called Pogo, drawn by Walt Kelly. And Pogo became famous for saying, we have seen the enemy, and he is us. I have seen the enemy, and he is me. He is me.